Greetings, comrades, and welcome to How the Red Was Won, a podcast about organizing in the South, Texas fascism, and how to fight back. It's me, Jen Big Nasty, and we are continuing our reading of R. Palma Dutt's Fascism and Social Revolution. We are now on chapter 5, titled How Fascism Came in Italy. There's a pretty good chance that there's some Italian words in this chapter that I'm gonna mispronounce, and you know what? That's fine. It's gonna be fine, y'all, okay? Let's just jump right into it, okay? In the light of this general understanding of the character and role of fascism and of the conditions of its development, it is now possible to examine more closely the concrete historical manifestations of fascism and, in particular, its development in Italy and Germany. For this purpose, it is necessary, first, to review the conditions of the transition to fascism in these countries. It is then necessary to examine more closely the program and practice of fascism, especially as demonstrated in these two leading countries. And then we have, of course, subsections. Subsection 1 is titled, The Priority of Italian Fascism. Why did fascism, the outstanding development of modern capitalist policy, develop its first distinctive and complete form in Italy, a secondary capitalist country? The question bears a certain analogy to the question often asked why the world proletarian revolution should have conquered first, not in the most advanced capitalist country, but in the relatively less developed Russia. In both cases, a general world development of the imperialist epoch first reached its specific form, not at the main centers of world imperialism, but at the point where the complex of conditions of extreme contradictions made its appearance first possible, and only more slowly spread beyond the original country. The reasons for the opening of the world socialist revolution in Russia have long been cleared. Russia was the weakest link of world imperialism. It represented the combination, on the one side, of the weakest bourgeoisie and of the greatest corruption and collapse of the old regime, and, on the other side, of the most politically developed proletariat, of the highest proportion of the proletariat in large-scale industry, and of the most conscious and highly trained revolutionary party of the proletariat in established leadership of the majority of the workers. The case of Italy and fascism is more complex. In fact, embryonic forms of fascism already developed in other countries before Italy, notably in Finland, Hungary, Poland, and Germany. But it was in Italy that fascism was first elaborated into a complete system and became, during the succeeding decade, the recognized principal model. Why was this? We have seen that fascism develops where the proletarian revolution draws visibly close, but is held in by reformist leadership. This was certainly the case in Italy after the war. But in the immediate post-war period, did not the proletarian revolution far more closely threaten in Germany than in Italy? Why then the difference and the very much later development of fascism in Germany? The answer lies not only in the very much greater strength and long-drawn resistance of the German proletariat, but in the basic differences of conditions of the revolutionary movement in the two countries. In Germany, a mass revolution took place, but the social democracy was able to retain control of the main body of the working class movement and to rob the revolution of its fruits. In Italy, on the other hand, there was only the menace of a revolution, but the old social democratic leadership lost effective control of the mass movement. In consequence, the methods of the bourgeoisie in the two countries necessarily differed. In Germany, the proletarian revolution actually overthrew the old regime in 1918, but the workers were robbed of the fruits of their victory by the social democratic leadership. The task of the bourgeoisie in the first stage became to limit the successful revolution, whose victory could not, for the moment, be questioned. For this purpose, the direct governmental leadership of social democracy was essential to the bourgeoisie as the sole salvation. Only later, as the influence of social democracy weakened and the menace of the proletarian revolution grew, in spite of and against social democracy, did the German bourgeoisie require to bring into play the additional weapon of fascism against the working class. In Italy, on the other hand, no revolution took place after the war, but only a mass revolutionary wave of great power. The highest mass revolutionary wave of those countries, the victor countries, where the war was not followed by revolution. There was no question of strangling an already victorious mass revolution by setting social democracy in power as a supposed leadership and voice of the triumphant revolution. The government remained throughout directly in the hands of the bourgeoisie. But the old social democratic leadership lost control of the mass movement, which was rapidly advancing to revolution. The task for the bourgeoisie became to prevent the menacing proletarian revolution. For this purpose, social democracy could serve as the brake to disorganize the workers' forces. But to smash the workers' forces, fascism was necessary. In contrast to Britain and France, the mass revolutionary wave after the war in Italy was so high as to make the bourgeoisie democratic forms inadequate. Extraordinary forms had to be brought into play. But it was not so high as to reach open insurrection and overthrow of the government, and to the necessity of the bourgeoisie making a show of surrendering power. The bourgeoisie only required to change the forms and methods of power. For this reason, Italy, despite the lower level of revolutionary development than Germany, gave the first example of the new fascist dictatorship to which Germany only reached later. Italian fascism revealed fascism as a species of preventative counter-revolution. So, he just states that so nice and plainly, right? The small differences between the rise of fascism in both countries, right? And this is all happening right at the end of the First World War, right? Both countries looked a little bit different. Both countries had, the working class was like ready for change, for revolutionary change, ready at least mentally, but not materially, right? And so they weren't able to rise up. They definitely tried in Germany, and I think we all know, like what happened to Rosa Luxemburg, with the Social Democrats crushing the revolutionaries essentially, and taking power that way. But in Italy, they didn't even get that far, right? Okay. Section 2, Socialism in Italy. The relatively backward economic development of Italy meant that the industrial proletariat, especially in large industry, was proportionally much weaker than in the leading industrial countries such as Germany, Britain, and the United States. Of the 16.8 million occupied persons recorded in the 1911 census, 9 million, or 54%, were recorded as engaged in agriculture and fisheries. 243,000 industrial establishments were recorded as employing 2.3 million workers. The 1927 census of industries reported 2.9 million industrial workers in manufacturing production, but 1.5 million of these were employed in the establishments of less than 10 workers. Only 695 factories had over 500 workers, with a total of 692,000 workers. Nevertheless, the dominant numerical strength of the industrial and agricultural proletariat combined, especially together with the poor peasantry, should not be underestimated. On the basis of the 1911 census statistics, it was calculated that of the 16.8 million occupied persons of the agricultural proletariat numbered 6.2 millions, and the proletariat in industry and transport 4 million, or a total of over 10 million, or over 60%. Further, socialism, on the basis of a revolutionary program, reached an overwhelming mass support after the war. The Italian Socialist Party, previously weak and dominated by reformism and collaborationist policies until 1910, began to move to the left and fight against the Tripoli War in 1911. In 1912, it strengthened itself by expelling the chauvinist reformists under Bonamy and Bistolati, at the Reggio Emilia Congress. Thereafter, the membership, previously dwindling from 36,000 in 1906 to 24,000 in 1910, shot up from 27,000 in 1912 to 48,000 in 1914. Thus strengthened, and with the added advantage of a delayed entry of Italy into the war, only after a protracted dispute which divided also the bourgeoisie, the Italian Socialist Party was not swept in the wake of the war, but took the Zimmerwald line. It emerged from the war with an increased membership of 70,000 and high popularity and prestige. So a lot of numbers there, but basically, after World War I, the Italian Socialist Party, doubled or more in size. It got big. The revolutionary wave after the war reached very great heights in Italy, affecting all strata. The industrial workers, the demobilized soldiers, the agricultural proletariat, and the poor peasantry. A widespread strike movement developed, both economic and political land seizures by the peasantry, etc. The Socialist Party, affiliated with the Communist International, in March 1919 by executive decision, which was confirmed by an overwhelming majority at the Bologna Congress in October. On this basis, the party went to the elections in November 1919 on a communist program of dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviets, and for this program, won over 1/3 of the total vote of the whole population, emerging as the strongest party with 156 seats out of 508. At the same time as Mussolini and his fascists were unable to win a single seat. The membership of the party rose to 200,000, and of the Confederation of Labor, which was aligned to the party, to 2 million. At the municipal elections in 1920, the party won control of over 2,000 communes, or 1/3 of the total. At the height of the revolutionary wave, the government was powerless to act, as shown in its passivity during the occupation of the factories in 1920, since it could not count on the support of the military forces. The expectation of the social revolution was general. Nevertheless, no revolution took place because there was no decisive revolutionary leadership. As the Executive Committee of the Communist International wrote in October 1920, the PSI, which is the Italian Socialist Party, acts with too much hesitation. It is not the party which leads the masses, but the masses which push the party. In Italy, there exist all the necessary conditions for a victorious revolution, except one, a good working class organization. And that's the end of that quote. That's really sad, actually. 2 million party members and just weak and reformist leadership. Sounds familiar. The truth of this was abundantly shown in 1919 to 20. No communist party existed until 1921, when the main revolutionary wave had passed. Anarchist and syndicalist tendencies and confusions on one side, reformism and control of the principal mass organizations on the other, a passive, hesitating, centrist leadership between. This constituted the main picture of the leadership of the Italian working class during the revolutionary wave. Although the Italian Socialist Party had affiliated to the Communist International in 1919, it retained at the very heart of the leadership, in control of the most strategic points, convicted enemies of communism. The old reformist leadership under Turati and de Aragona, it doesn't matter, who had dominated the party until 1910. These had no longer more than a small following among the workers, as Congress votes showed, but they were strong at the center, dominating the parliamentary group and controlling the official machinery of the Confederation of Labor. They remained in the party despite the adoption of the communist program, openly in order to defeat the revolutionary line. As one of their leaders, Prompolini, explained at the conference of the reformist wing in September 1922, quote, "By remaining in the party, we were unable to fulfill our duty as socialists. It would have been quite impossible for us to have accomplished outside the party the task we accomplished inside." End quote. It was manifest that if the party were to achieve its task of revolutionary leadership, the first necessity was to remove the enemies of the revolution from the strategic leading positions and replace them by revolutionaries. On this demand, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, under the leadership of Lenin, conscious of the impending danger in Italy, if this were not carried out, exerted the whole of its pressure and authority. The executive long urged, and finally, by the summer of 1920, when the matter was too serious for further parleying, demanded in the name of the whole international movement the expulsion of Turati and the reformist leadership. But the centrist leadership under Cerati refused, and the fate of the Italian Revolution was sealed for many years to come. The issue came to a head at the Second Congress of the Communist International in August 1920. Cerati set himself in opposition to Lenin and to the whole international leadership, preferring unity with Turati and the reformists to unity with international communism. And the bulk of the party, under his leadership, passed out of the International. The break followed at the Livorno Congress in January 1921. Cerati and the centrists had a following of 98,000. Turati and the reformist 14,000, and the communist 58,000, who thereon formed the Italian Communist Party. Cerati and his wing, who styled themselves Unity Communists, were appealed to by the communists to unite with them in a single communist party, which would have thus constituted 90% of the old party, free from reformism. But they preferred unity with the 14,000 reformists to unity with the 58,000 communists. Thus, the workers' ranks were broken. That's sad. We got one more paragraph and then I'll chat. 2 years later, on the very eve of Mussolini's coming to power, Cerati was compelled to recognize his fatal error. At the Rome Congress of the now weakened and dwindled Socialist Party in the beginning of October 1922, the Cerati leadership finally carried through the expulsion of Turati and the reformists, now grown to nearly half the membership, and applied for readmission to the Communist International. Our fault, declared Cerati at this Congress, is that we never sufficiently prepared ourselves for the events that have overtaken us. Today, we believe it essential to abandon the democratic illusion and to create a combative, active, and audacious party. End quote. But it was then too late. The irreparable harm had been done. Within 4 weeks, Mussolini was in power. And the message of the Communist International to the Rome Congress declared, quote, "He cannot be called a leader of the proletarian masses, who with great effort and after the lapse of several years comes to a correct conclusion, but rather he who can detect a tendency at its birth and can warn the workers in time of peril that menaces them." End quote. So, this isn't really unique to Italy, right? So many potential revolutions have been squashed, internally by reformist leadership, by leadership that chooses the safe route, right? That chooses to protect themselves, right? Rather than taking the bold step that is leading the revolution, right? And so you see that when the party had this internal disagreements and debates, right, which is allowed. We all don't agree on the same thing all the time, and internal debate and disagreement is fine, but the party split, right, into these three different factions, only one of which was actually communist, and the other group was kind of wishy-washy on it, had potential. The communists invited them to come join them, and then they would have had a majority, and they probably could have done something, if not revolution, stopped the rise of Mussolini, maybe. But they decided to side with the reformists, which weakened the workers, split the party, and led to the rise of Mussolini. And it's sad, obviously. Like, we know what happens next. We're going to talk about it more, but you know, we know history a little bit. And yet these things still happen especially here, right? In our left parties. We have so many small left parties that really struggle to unite. And it's really sad to see happen over and over and over again, right? Like, we have not learned from the past. All right, subsection 3. Was revolution possible in Italy? This understanding of the inner situation of Italian socialism during the critical years of 1919 to 1922 is essential for the understanding of the failure of the Italian Revolution during those years, despite the favorable conditions and the readiness and self-sacrifice of the masses, and the resulting advance and victory of fascism. The revolutionary wave of 1919 to 20 spent itself in a confusion of unorganized partial struggles and demonstrations without decisive leadership or concentrated aim. The Socialist Party leadership gave out the watchword, quote, "The revolution is not made, the revolution comes," end quote. Under cover of this fatal non-Marxist conception, the responsibility of leadership was in fact abandoned. The energy and self-sacrifice of the masses went to waste in fruitless, uncoordinated actions. Again, we have that energy here and now when we see things like Luigi, things like that happening, right? The masses want change, want revolutionary change, but we have no leadership. The final climax of the revolutionary wave was reached with the occupation of the factories in northern Italy in September 1920. This action of the workers was undertaken in response to a lockout begun by the employers and threatening to be made general. Beginning from the metallurgical industry in Milan at the end of August, it spread to all industries until by September 3rd, 500,000 workers were in unchallenged occupation of the factories, establishing their own workers' committees with armed guards. The government and employers were powerless. The troops could not be counted on to act against the workers. The classic conditions of revolution were present. The prime minister, I should know how to say his name, Giolitti? Sorry. Temporized. The extra-legal fascist formations were only then an impotent handful, and found it more prudent to applaud the workers' movement from a distance, proclaiming noisily their sympathy for the occupation, in which they had no part, and which Mussolini declared in his journal to be a great revolution. And he said that in September of 1920. The bourgeoisie in this situation could only count on the reformist leadership to save them, but the reformist leadership did not fail them. It was obvious that the occupation of the factories, if it remained a passive economic movement with political power remaining in the hands of the bourgeoisie, could only end in stiflation and failure. The condition of victory was that the movement begun by the occupation of the factories should be extended to the conquest of political power by the workers, which the bourgeoisie was then powerless to resist. Just this the reformists resisted, insisting on confining the movement as purely an economic movement, the same tactics as the British general strike in 1926, and negotiating with the government for a settlement. The critical decision was taken on September 11th at a combined conference of the Socialist Party and the Confederation of Labor by a vote of 591,245 to 409,569. Control was placed in the hand of the Confederation of Labor, that is, the reformist leadership. The reformist leadership entered into immediate negotiations with, again, his name, Giolitti, and on September 19th, a settlement was reached by which evacuation of the factories was conceded in return for a 20% wage increase and a promise of a share of workers' control in industry. And then we have a parentheses here. The promise went the way of all such promises. The subsequent Joint Commission, established to work out the details of the scheme, broke down. Finally, the government in 1921 introduced an emasculated Bill of Labor Control, similar to the German Works Council Act. So, never accept concessions from the bourgeoisie because they do not follow through. Let's see. The essence of the settlement was the evacuation of the factories. The reformist leaders ordered the workers to leave the factories, what neither the employers nor the government, nor the police, nor the armed forces could effect. This was effected by the reformist leadership, to get the workers out of the factories and hand them back to capitalism. Man, that is really the danger of reformist leadership, is that they are going to fuck you over. Oh, no, we got you guys a 20% increase. Okay, the demand was workers own the factories. That's... It's not the same thing, man. Was the victory of the working class revolution in Italy possible in the situation of September 1920? Of this, there can be no doubt in the united evidence of all parties. The liberal anti-fascist historian Salvemini, who was mainly concerned for the purposes of his argument to minimize the revolutionary issues of the situation in Italy before fascism, in order to deny this bourgeois justification of fascism, nevertheless writes of this period. So this is Salvemini. It's titled, the work that this is in is titled The Fascist Dictatorship. It's from 1928. Quote, had the leaders of the General Confederation of Labor and of the Socialist Party wished to strike a decisive blow, here was the opportunity. The bankers, the big industrialists, the big landlords waited for the social revolution as sheep wait to be led to the slaughter. If a communist revolution could be brought about by bewilderment and cowardice on the part of the ruling classes, the Italian people in September 1920 could have made as many communist revolutions as they wished. End quote. That's got to be tough to look back on as one of those workers a couple years later and be like, God damn it, we were so close. And now look. That's tough. Okay. The leading Italian journal, I really can't read this, Corriere della Sera. Did I just pretend it's Spanish and kind of read it like that? Corriere della Sera, whatever, wrote at the time in its issue of September 29th, 1920, quote, Italy has been in peril of collapse. There has been no revolution, not because there was anyone to bar its way, but because the General Confederation of Labor has not wished it, end quote. The reformist leadership themselves boasted of having averted revolution by their action, and thereafter, in exactly the same way as the German reformists later, complained bitterly of the ingratitude of the bourgeoisie in repaying their services by blows of fascism. Quote, "But after we had the honor," stated the Secretary of the General Confederation of Labor in a speech delivered 2 years after the occupation of the factories, "of preventing a revolutionary catastrophe, fascism arrived." End quote. That was from the Daily Herald, April 28. So shocked. We gave the rich everything they wanted. How could they do this to us? Jesus Christ. All right. Thus, in the agreed testimony of the bourgeoisie and of the reformists alike, the communist revolution was fully possible in Italy in September 1920 and was only prevented by the reformist leadership. Fascism played no part in this. It was only after the revolution was already defeated, after the working class ranks were disorganized and disillusioned by the reformist betrayal, after this had begun to show itself in a rapid collapse of membership and organization, that then fascism stepped forward to show its prowess in beating the already defeated workers. Damn. The surrender of the factories took place in September 1920. From that point, the Italian working class movement went downwards. After the occupation of the factories in September 1920, the idea spread among the people that the revolution had failed and they grew discouraged. That sentence was from Salvini again. The membership of the party and of the trade unions began rapidly to fall. The party membership fell from 216,000 in 1920 to 170,000 in January 21. Well, yeah, the people were disheartened and knew that y'all weren't going to help them. So, you know, they just kind of accepted their lot in life. It's really sad. In November 1920, the first fascist terrorist action of blood and fire against the workers was launched at Bologna. The sequence of dates is obvious. The fascist jackal strikes only the already wounded proletarian lion. Fascism was not the weapon of defense of the bourgeoisie against the advancing proletarian offensive, but the vengeance of the bourgeoisie against the retreating proletariat. After reformism had broken the workers' ranks, to follow up the victory by smashing the working class organizations. That was the end of section 3. So, wow. Basically, Italy could have had a communist revolution in 1920. All these people occupying the factories, refusing to give up the holding of these things, demanding that the workers own the factories now. The military refused to go in and, break this up. The bourgeoisie couldn't do anything about it. Like that, it was right there. It was right there. But because the party leadership was just these reformist, weak, spineless fucks, they gave in. They gave in to the demands of the bourgeoisie to let them in. Gave the workers scraps, of course, right, to shut them up. And then fascism saw this. Fascism as an entity, fascism as a growing movement in the bourgeoisie, in the far right, and was like, oh, I see, they're cowards, so we're gonna really step in now, that last sentence is good. The fascist jackal strikes only the already wounded proletarian lion. See, so fascism is seen here not as a weapon of the bourgeoisie wielded against the rising proletariat, but, after the reformists already broke the proletariat, fascism is used as a, what do you call it? like a revenge, a weapon of vengeance. They're like, this is for ever thinking you could have any power. Section 4. The growth and victory of fascism. Fascism had existed in Italy since the beginning of 1919. In fact, since the hired interventionist campaign of 1915. The former Socialist Party agitator Mussolini, who had throughout his career performed a doubtful role of advocacy for bomb attentatus. Attentatus. That can't be right. More words I can't say. Herveest, extravagance, etc. Changed his coat with the celerity of social chauvinists. Basically, he was in the party. He was a socialist. I think that's pretty well known, right? Mussolini understood socialism, and that is a part of the reason why he was able to fight against it, right? Because he got it. Like, and you see that now, right? You see these idiots on the right that don't understand socialism, and it's very easy to discredit them. But sometimes you see the ones that do, and those are the scary ones. So, he had, throughout his career, performed this role of advocacy, but he changed his tune, which is usual, was social chauvinist there was, okay, and passed within a few weeks from editing the socialist anti-war Avanti, wherein he had denounced the bourgeois war during August and September, to founding, with French government funds, the interventionist Popolo d'Italia in November. The Fasci de Arazione Interventista, which he founded in Milan in 1915, were the nucleus of future fascism. Okay, so he just formed these groups that were growing into being the fascist party. After the war, Mussolini and his followers, their previous campaigning basis gone with the end of the war, sought for a new one, and founded the first Fascio di Combattimento in Milan in March 1919 on a confused chauvinist Republican and revolutionary sounding program. This was the official starting point of fascism. The Fasci were constituted a political party in December 1920. It happened very quickly. During 1919 and up to the autumn of 1920, that is, during the Revolutionary Wave, fascism had no strength or popular support. The official authorities encouraged it. The Popolo d'Italia was distributed by the army authorities free among the troops in 1919 and 1920. It's like a newspaper, fascist newspaper, that they were just giving to the troops. Here, guys, read this. But fascism could win no support. At the elections in November 1919, fascism could not win a seat. Mussolini received 4,795 votes in Milan against the socialist 180,000. The total membership throughout the country was small. Fascism had to swim with the revolutionary stream. Its program called for the abolition of the monarchy and nobility, confiscation of war profits, international disarmament, abolition of the stock exchanges, the land for peasants, workers, control of industry, etc. Its propaganda glorified strikes, food riots, calling for the hanging of speculators, the seizure of land by the peasantry, occupations of factories by the workers, and denounced the state as the enemy. And then here's a quote from their newspaper in 1920, "Down with the state in all its forms." Fascism is so good at, like, some of that sounds all right. Some of that sounds okay, you know? Abolition of the monarchy, fuck yeah, you know? Strikes are good, but then it's insidious. Fascism is fucking insidious. Okay. During this period, fascism was still in preparation and had no important place among the weapons of the bourgeoisie to meet the proletarian offensive. in the face of the strength of the revolutionary wave of the bourgeoisie, had to use other methods. So far as an attempt was made to build up an alternative new party to counter and outbid the Socialist Party, this attempt was concentrated on the Catholic Popular Party, which was constituted in 1919 with a demagogic program, and was utilized to split the rural proletariat and peasantry, winning 100 seats in 1919 against the Socialist 156. But the main method of the bourgeoisie was the method of liberalism and concessions, so long as their forces were unprepared. The granting of shorter hours, wage increases, the labor control bill, and similar legislation. This was the line of the successive governments of Nitti, Giolitti, Bonomi, and Facta. They calculated on the reformist socialist leadership to break the revolutionary offensive. And they calculated correctly, didn't they? Meanwhile, under cover of this policy of seeming weakness and retreat, they were preparing the armed counter-revolution. The gendarmerie, or carabinerie were increased. What is this word? Oh, it's like, it's military. It's like militants. Okay. Were increased from 28,000 at the end of the war to 60,000 by the summer of 1920. Okay, so we're increasing these armed militias, essentially. A new special force, the Royal Guard, was created, 25,000 strong. At the same time, the fascist hooligan bands were being equipped and armed by the authorities. Same thing happened in Germany. Thus, the transfer of the policy of a Giolitti, doesn't matter, to a policy of Mussolini was no sudden volte-face of the Italian bourgeoisie. They were two halves of the single policy, right? Mussolini was the foster child and creation of Giolitti, just as Hitler was the foster child of Brüning. The task of Giolitti and the liberal democratic governments was to fool the proletariat with sham concessions, so long as the proletarian forces were too strong to be defeated, and assist the reformist leadership to break them up from within. Meanwhile, these liberal democratic governments were secretly equipping and arming fascism. When this first stage was completed, the proletarian forces had been disorganized by reformism. The violent counter-revolution was let loose. The violent offensive of fascism was carried forward under the benevolent protection of Giolitti and his successors. This second stage continued from the autumn of 1920 to autumn of 1922. Reformism continued to retreat and trust in parliamentarism for defense. When the second stage had done its work and the proletarian forces had been smashed and beaten up, the final transference to open fascism was accomplished. Giolitti and his successors peaceably made way for Mussolini. The cycle was complete. The continuity of policy runs in practice right through. Oh man, so when liberals, when reformists make peace with the far right, make way for them to come to power, peacefully transition power, that makes them accomplices. That makes them just as guilty in the rise of fascism as the fascists, right? And then the reformist leadership of the left placated them, right? Made them, oh, it's fine. We got our 20% wage increase. We're fine. It's fine. Hey. This mechanism of the transition to fascism, exactly repeated in Germany, is the essential key to the correct understanding of the real relationship of bourgeois democracy and fascism. Fascism grew up and grew strong after the autumn of 1920. and was able to exercise its wholesale violence only under the direct protection and assistance of the bourgeois democratic governments, of the military authorities, of the police, of the magistry, and the big bourgeoisie. From the autumn of 1920, the big landlords and the big industrialists poured support to the fascist bands to exercise terrorism against the peasantry and the proletariat. The membership shot up, according to Mussolini, from 20,000 in 1920 to 248,000 in 1921. The army authorities supplied arms. Professional officers trained the bands and directed operations. The General Staff issued a circular in October 1920 instructing divisional commanders to support the fascist organizations. The workers and peasants were rigorously disarmed. The fascists carried arms with impunity. The police and gendarmerie, just other militants, either directly assisted the fascists or remained passive. The magistracy habitually subjected to savage sentences workers who attempted to defend themselves while releasing the fascists. So, if a worker got in a fight with a fascist, the worker got in trouble. The fascist was released. Again, things we see present day. The conscious policy of Giolitti and Bonamy in permitting and supporting fascist violence has been already noted back on 20 pages ago. The semi-official spokesman of fascism, Luigi Viari, in his Awakening of Italy, notes that Giolitti refused to interfere with the repressive actions of the fascists, illegal though they were. The pro-fascist A is his first initial, Zerboglio, in his standard Il Fascismo in 1922, wrote, quote, "The government more or less openly made use of fascism. The socialist press are piling up proofs of government tolerance towards the fascists, and it cannot honestly be disputed that some of this evidence appears convincing," end quote. The leading American journalist, Maurer, recorded, quote, "In the presence of murder, violence, arson, the police remained neutral. When armed bands compelled the socialists to resign from office under pain of death, or regularly tried and condemned their enemies to blows, banishment, or execution, these functionaries merely shrugged their shoulders. Sometimes carabiners and royal guards openly made common cause with the fascists and paralyzed the resistance of the peasants. Against the fascists alone, the latter might have held their own. Against the fascists and the police together, they were helpless, and their complaints merely caused the authorities to arrest them as guilty of attempting to defend themselves. Socialists were condemned for alleged crimes months, years before. Fascists taken red-handed were released for want of evidence," end quote. And that was Maurer. It doesn't say the year. I assume this is 22. Yeah, 1922. And again, quote, "From the army of the fascists received sympathy, assistance, and war material. Officers in uniform took part in the punitive expeditions. The fascists were allowed to turn national barracks into their private arsenals," end quote. Similarly, the notorious advocate of fashion, Odon Poor, notes in his, just called Fascism, that the, quote, "the fascists had been equipped largely on the quiet from the regular army," end quote. Another American journalist who was in Italy in 1921, J. Carter, reports, quote, "The fascisti had carte blanche to beat up their opponents throughout Italy, while the government pretended to be neutral," end quote. And that was that guy Carter in June of 27. One of the standard writers on fascism, generally sympathetic, G. Prezzolini, in his La Fascisme 1925, writes, quote, "They could organize themselves in armed corps and kill right and left, with the certainty of impunity and with the complicity of the police. It is thus no overstatement to recognize that the fascists fought with 99 chances out of 100 of gaining the victory." End quote. The fascist offensive of terrorism, destruction, and murder, which was launched at Bologna in November 1920, with the overthrow of the newly elected Socialist Town Council and sacking of the Chamber of Labor, was thereafter systematically developed and extended with the manifest planning of a military campaign through the industrial region and with wholesale sporadic violence in the agricultural areas. Socialist, trade union, and cooperative buildings painfully erected by millions of sacrifices of a generation of workers were burned and sacked. Workers' newspapers and printing presses were destroyed. Socialist municipal councils were expelled from office. Militant workers and peasants were beaten up or murdered. All this went forward with the conveyance of the civil authorities, who normally followed up each fascist coup, expelling a duly elected socialist municipal council by appointing a special commissioner in its place. The normal procedure when a workers' building was threatened by the fascists would be for a special force of the armed police or the royal guards to appear first to protect it. These would search for and remove any arms, disarm the workers in it, and prevent any workers' demonstration approaching it. The fascists would then arrive with full arms and machine guns. The police forces would then declare resistance impossible and retire, and the fascists would be left free to work their will on the defenseless building and disarmed workers. It's ACAB all the way through. Between January and May 1921, according to figures published by the Italian Socialist Party at the time, the fascists destroyed 120 labor headquarters, attacked 243 socialist centers and other buildings, killed 202 workers, that is in addition to the 44 killed by the police, and wounded 1,144. During this period, 2,240 workers were arrested by the police. 162 fascists were arrested. During 1921 to 22, up to the fascist dictatorship, 500 labor halls and cooperative stores were burned, and 900 socialist municipalities were dissolved. Wow. They really thoroughly destroyed any worker power. How did reformism and centrism in control of the majority of the working class meet this offensive of the bourgeoisie? They preached to the workers to put their trust in legal and pacific methods and use of the ballot. In May 1921, Giolitti held a general election, hoping that the reign of violence would have already broken the workers' forces. The total socialist and communist vote, nevertheless, actually exceeded the 1919 total, reaching 1.8 million against... Oh, it's close. Hold on, I gotta read the whole number. Let's see. So the social and communist vote was actually higher than in 1919, reaching 1,861,000 against 1,840,000. So a difference of like a 60,000 increase. 122 socialists and 16 communists were returned, totaling 138 against only 35 fascists. That's like in that won their elections, right? 138 socialists and only 35 fascists. The workers were endeavoring to use the ballot to their defense. The socialist organ Avanti, in illusory triumph, proclaimed, "The Italian proletariat has submerged the fascist reaction under an avalanche of red votes." The reality was otherwise. The avalanche of red votes made no difference to a situation of civil war. The violence, in place of being diminished, was increased. So, once again, you can't vote your way out of fascism. You just can't. They tried to. They won, and it didn't matter. The next step of the reformist leadership was to spread even more disastrous illusions as to the real character of the struggle. They endeavored to enter into a formal treaty of peace with fascism. On August 3rd, 1921, the Fascist Socialist Treaty was signed, proclaiming an end to all acts of violence. This was signed by Mussolini and his colleagues on one side, and on the other by the executive of the Socialist Party, of the Socialist Parliamentary Group, and of the General Confederation of Labor. The Communist Party refused to take part in this criminal comedy. The agreement was not worth the paper it was written on. The fascist violence went forward, and Mussolini explained the violation of his pledge by declaring that it had been overridden by his supporters. Oh, that's nice. The final step of the reformist leadership was to endeavor to enter into a parliamentary ministerial combination. After the resignation of Facta in July 1922, Turati, as the socialist parliamentary leader, saw the king. There's still a king, I guess. I didn't realize. When the attempt to secure agreed terms for a ministerial coalition was unsuccessful, the reformist leadership conceived the idea of calling a general strike at this late stage as a weapon of extra parliamentary pressure to bring about the formation of a coalition government. The general strike was called on August 1st, wholly without preparation, and was explained by Turati to be a strike in defense of the state. Under these conditions, the general strike was inevitably a failure, reaching only a section of membership of the Confederation of Labor and winning no general response because of the utter lack of serious preparation or fighting lead. The effect was only to play into the hands of the fascists, who intensified their attack. And there's people here that are always like, general strike, and they'll pick a date. They'll be like, general strike November 1st. And while I agree with the sentiment, a general strike in the US could really shut things down and maybe lead to more revolutionary building at the very least, or at least concessions, which I think is really all they want. You can't just call a general strike when people aren't unionized, when people are living paycheck to paycheck, when things are bad here for a lot of communities in a lot of ways, but not enough people are at the fuck it, I have nothing to lose point, which is unfortunately why I always say that things are going to have to get worse before they get better. And you can get mad at me for saying that, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that it's not true. All right, we're almost done. The conditions were now complete for the final step of the open transmission of power by the bourgeoisie into the hands of the fascists. This took place in October. The transmission was carried through by the combined action of the king, the army chiefs of the Facta cabinet, and period. A theoretical March on Rome of fascists was organized for October 28th. This march was, in fact, organized under 6 army generals, and the commander-in-chief of the army addressed an enthusiastic fascist gathering on the evening of October 27th. The Facta cabinet went through the form of proclaiming martial law. This only had the effect that the civil authorities handed over their powers to the military throughout the country, who promptly allowed the fascists to occupy the public offices, railways, postal and telegraphic offices, etc. After this had been successfully achieved, the king announced on the morning of October 28th that he refused to sign the decree of martial law. Martial law was accordingly withdrawn. It was, in consequence, declared impossible to defend Rome against the fascists. The Facta cabinet, which had already been in negotiation with the fascists, resigned. Mussolini was invited to form a ministry and arrived at Rome on October 30th in a sleeping car. Such was the so-called fascist revolution, which was in fact carried through from start to finish by the bourgeois dictatorship from above. The full forms of the fascist dictatorship were not immediately decided and carried through, as in Germany 11 years later, because the methods were still being experimentally discovered. At first, a show of parliamentary forms and permission of opposition parties and press was maintained alongside wholesale governmentally maintained violence and terrorism in practice. It was not until 1926 that the completed fascist dictatorship was finally established, with complete suppression of all other parties, organizations, and press. The workers' trade unions being officially incorporated in the fascist syndicates, and the principal reformist trade union leaders, including here's that guy's name again, Aragona, de Aragona, passing over to fascism. The Italian example provides the classic demonstration of the transition to fascism. The lines of development, the roles of the different elements, the successive stages of this tragedy of the working class stand out clear and sharp for all to learn. What are the principal conclusions that stand out? First, the revolutionary wave in Italy was broken, not by the bourgeoisie, not by fascism, but by its own inner weakness and lack of revolutionary leadership, by reformism. Second, fascism only came to the front after the proletarian advance was already broken from within and disillusionment had been spread. Fascism appeared on the scene after the battle in order to play the hero under police and military protection in harassing and slaughtering an army already in retreat. Third, the transition to open fascist dictatorship was no sudden abrupt break and reversal of bourgeois policy, but a continuation of bourgeois policy into new forms. Fascism was prepared and fostered within the conditions of bourgeois democracy, alongside a show of liberalism and concessions, so long as the bourgeois forces were unprepared to be placed in power when the conditions were ripe. All these lessons were demonstrated in the classic example of Italian fascism. Nevertheless, they were not yet learnt by the international working class. They were to be demonstrated anew on a yet wider scale in the next decade in Germany. That's chapter 5. I really like how it ends with this. I love a bullet point. I love a 1, 2, 3. And this, how he sums it all up at the end here. First, they crushed the revolution, not from the outside, but from within, because the reformist leadership fucked over the working class. Second, disillusionment spread. People were upset by the revolution not happening, right? And then fascism was like, hey, I have an idea. Oh, you guys are upset with how things happened? I have an idea. Guess what? And then of course the police and military presence helps keep the workers in line. And then third, the showing that it's not a sudden huge break from what the bourgeoisie is and already does, right? That it's a continuation of bourgeois policy into new forms. It's changed, it's evolved, but it's not a whole flip. It's not something where you notice it change, right? And I think that that's something that Americans struggle with, is they think that, oh, Trump is a fascist or whatever. Look at all these horrible things he's doing. And like, yeah, obviously, like, he's doing horrible things. But is it that different? Is it that different than what was happening under Biden? You know, people forget, or purposefully forget, that Obama was called the deporter in chief, right? Obama is who hired Tom Homan originally and gave him an award for being so good at deportations, right? Trump still hasn't beat Obama's numbers. Obviously, it's ramped up and ugly in different ways now. It's more openly violent, but deportation is always violent. Taking people's parents away and shipping them to a country they haven't been to in years, decades, is violent. And not even mentioning how the reason that people come to the U.S. is because what the U.S. has done to their home country. That people don't take this dangerous journey up through Central America, across Mexico on La Bestia, right? The big train that's dangerous, that crushes people. People die on that all the time. They don't do that just for the lulz, you know. They do it because things are so bad in where they came from. And that is because of what the U.S. has done to South America, Central and South America, through coups, through overthrowing governments, through the way that our corporations take control of the resources and don't let the people have fucking access to the things that their own country produces. So that's, you know, maybe I should read George Jackson to y'all next. I am big in the George Jackson school of thought that the U.S. has always been fascist, and white people just don't see it all the time. Middle-income white people don't experience it in the same way that like a poor Black or immigrant person does. And so when you see it now more openly, and it scares the white people, as it should, as it fucking should, but it seems new. And as Dutt talks about here, it's not really that different than what the bourgeoisie was doing. It is different. It is horrific. But it's small changes. It's not a big flip. It's incremental. Or if not incremental, it's tweaks. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, this book is good. Thank you for listening. Cheers.